Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I am so incredibly pleased to welcome you to the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired 2021 Advocacy Days. I'm Denise Jess, the Council's Executive Director and CEO. And boy, this is a day that we have been holding in great anticipation, actually since last year when COVID rolled itself out and the Capitol closed down and we suspended our Advocacy Day event. The Council's advocacy work is a year-round, very robust, very rigorous program. And so we continued on, particularly in the focus of creating access to voting for folks during a pandemic, helping people understand how to access transportation, having important conversation with legislators and state agencies, but we needed to put our Advocacy Day event on hold. So coming back this year in a virtual setting and welcoming you all feels incredibly good. We have folks from all over the state joining us both this morning and in our afternoon session. And that also feels very powerful to know that we have folks who are living urban, folks who are living suburban, folks who are living in rural parts of the state, from, like the northern 2/3 all the way down to Wisconsin, to Madison and Milwaukee. So thank you so much for being here. Let me start with a couple of tech tips so that you feel like you have access to be able to frame questions as we're going throughout this next hour and a half. We're in a webinar format, so that means that you'll have access to putting questions that you'd like to ask in the chat or in the Q&A. And those will be monitored by Lynn from our staff, and periodically we'll pause to see what questions are there, and Lynn will share those out on your behalf. If you are a screen reader user, I'd recommend going to the chat function to add your questions. It's a bit more friendly than the Q&A function. So as a Windows user, you'll want to hit Alt-H. That will open the chat panel. If you are a Mac user, please hit Command-Shift-H, and that will open the chat panel. You're likely to need to tab down until you get the audio message that you can type, that you're in the typing space or the writing space. And then you just simply hit your enter key and your question goes live so that we have access to it. If for any reason you're having technical difficulties of any sort, or you're running into barriers putting your question into the chat or the Q&A, please feel free to call Kathleen from our staff or email her, and she can offer assistance. Kathleen's phone number, and several of you may have it already from the emails she's been sending you, but just to refresh, her phone number is 608-237-8120. Or you can email her at kcallen@wcblind.org. That's KCALLEN at wcblind.org. So with our technical tips kind of set aside and hopefully working well for everyone, let me review how we're going to spend our hour and a half together this morning. I will kick us off with talking a little bit about the Council's priorities, how we've determined those, how we set where we're going to put our energy, what our positions are, and then the many tools and methods that we use for supporting the advocacy of folks in the state who are living with blindness and visual impairment. Then I'll turn it over to Michael Blumenfeld and Aaron Fabrizius. Michael and Aaron are from the firm Blumenfeld and Associates, and we contract with Michael and Aaron as our public affairs liaisons. And I'll talk a little bit more about their role as I introduce them. And they'll be doing some focus on where are we at in the state budget, where are we at in the kind of the legislative climate, and what meaning does that have for the council's work? Where are we putting our energy in the legislature? We'll then move into talking about how do we, as citizens and residents of the state of Wisconsin, access our legislators and have meaningful and fruitful dialogue with them. There's some really good tips and tricks and things to avoid. And so Aaron, Michael, and I will all talk about that from our various perspectives. We had hoped to have a legislator visit with us this morning towards the end of our time together to talk about their experience of meeting with folks. And at the very last minute, things shifted, and that isn't going to be happening. It's a very, very busy time in the state legislature right now as we're gearing up for another budget cycle. And there are many hearings. So sometimes folks get pulled away to attend to these things. So if you would like to come back this afternoon and hear from Representative Subek, we'll provide an opportunity to join that afternoon panel later in the panel so that you can participate, and more information about that to come as well. So we have good technical folks here. I want to thank Mitch as well, who is monitoring our tech to make sure everything is functioning well. Michael and Aaron are here, and I'd like to do a shout out to our advocacy work group for starting to meet in January to plan the shape of this event, meeting every couple of weeks to really get us to the place of where we are today. So thank you so much, everyone, for your good work. So we have priorities that the council operates on for our advocacy work. As many of you know, the council has been around since 1952, and our primary mission is to promote the dignity and empowerment of people in Wisconsin who live with blindness and vision impairment. And the very first set of activities that the council took on under that mission were advocating on behalf of people who are blind and visually impaired in the state legislature. And as you know, the council has a long history of both board and executive directors, including myself, who live with vision impairment. So we bring that real world lived experience to this work, as well as listening to our staff and other folks who work with other folks who are blind and visually impaired. So it comes from a very informed place. In 2016, our board of directors made a very critical strategic decision that I'm very proud of them for making. They established 5 advocacy priorities. Those priorities are transportation, which also includes pedestrian safety, employment, education, healthcare, and long-term care, which also includes advocacy for the Office of the Blind and Visually Impaired, OBVI, which is nestled within the Department of Health. And then civil rights and ADA, And under that umbrella, we have done work on voting access, state website access, um, hunting and fishing access, and guide dog and service dog work. Those 5 priorities give us our marching orders to where we put our focus, and they've been so helpful in a number of ways. First, they allow us to keep our focus. There are so many ways that people who are blind and visually impaired are impacted by advocacy and the laws and the policies in this state, that we could spread ourselves incredibly thin. And when you're spread too thin, you're just not effective because everything becomes a priority. And where do you put your focus? As an executive director and an advocate, I get multiple invitations every month for us to put our advocacy energy into things that are interesting but would dilute our message. So it really allows us to stay focused on the work that is really important to Wisconsinites living with blindness. It allows us to be nimble. Things happen quickly in the state legislature. And if we needed to call together an advisory group or a committee every time we needed to make a decision, just things, opportunities would come and they would go, and we wouldn't be able to weigh in on them. So I'm very grateful for our board's work in establishing those priorities. So, how do we decide, even within those priorities, which are huge, how do we decide where we put our energy? Critical to deciding is feedback and engaging with our board, with our staff, with our constituencies to hear what is pressing, where are folks hitting barriers, where are they experiencing ease, where we've done really good work, or where we can take more opportunity to learn and apply it in other situations. So when we send out a survey, like we did last year, a very large scale advocacy survey, we're so grateful to you when you take the time to fill that out because it gives us that vital information for direction and where to put our energy. We reach out frequently and hear stories from folks. So when we do a call for stories, and ask you to share your experiences so that we can both be guided by them and help carry your stories into our conversations with state agencies and with legislators and with the governor's office. You're helping to inform and guide our advocacy agenda. And yeah, let's see, just to let me think for a second. And when folks reach out to us to ask for advocacy assistance, then we also learn about what's happening in the state. We've had a great example of that as we have had over the years a number of folks reach out to us because their communities were not walkable. And of course, as people who rely on walkable communities and transportation to be able to do our activities of daily life, not having accessible pedestrian signals or trying to cross very busy roadways or not having sidewalks, it's debilitating and we can't get to where we need to go. So hearing from you on those things, being able to offer guidance on how you work at a local level, and then knowing that that has implications on a wider state level, also helps guide our work. We think about what's the level of urgency that something really requires. So, transportation often floats to the top of our work because we need it urgently to be able to get to work, to be able to get to medical appointments, to fully participate in our community, including voting. And so a good portion of the council's work and energy focuses on transportation. There's been a lot of urgency around voting, especially as we moved into the pandemic and folks didn't feel as comfortable going into their polling places. There was urgency about trying to get an accessible absentee ballot for Wisconsinites who are blind and visually impaired to be able to vote privately and independently. We pay a lot of attention to opportunities and get on bandwagons when it makes sense and when it's appropriate. So the pandemic, while it's been a very difficult year, has given us some incredible opportunities that we do not want to miss out on. For example, Michael and Aaron will talk about this a little bit more. The governor is proposing some very wide scale broadband access increases. We want to be part of that conversation, and we are part of that conversation because we need that broadband across the state for all of our folks. And related to that are some fundamental accessibility issues. So we need to have those issues on lawmakers' radars. Vaccine rollout has been another really powerful opportunity. So many of us have hit barriers in trying to sign up for our vaccine with inaccessible websites or trying to get to a vaccine location with lack of transportation. So again, raising the bar and raising our voices around these issues so that these systems become responsive to the needs of folks who are blind and visually impaired is really critical. We have lots of tools for getting our work done. So often I think when folks think about advocacy, they only think about the state legislature. And while the state legislature and the governor are so critical because they are our lawmaking bodies, there's a lot that can happen outside the legislature. So that's been one of the things that the council has really put a lot of emphasis on in the last 4 years or so is doing a well-rounded advocacy approach. So what makes sense for us to do in the legislature? We know, for example, that having an accessible absentee ballot requires a law change. So we need to put our energy into asking that from our legislators. We know that having transportation, particularly in rural parts of the state, under the specialized transportation provision, requires budget. And we need our legislators to make sure that they are allocating at least 10% of an increase into those budget items so that we can increase transportation access. We know, for example, that there are programs designed to help people with disabilities move from education into the workforce. And we need the state legislature to properly fund those programs so that they continue and they become even more robust and even more inclusive of people with vision impairment. So we need our legislature, and that's part of your really vital role today and in the weeks to follow is having those conversations with legislators. I'm also noticing time, so I'm being very aware of that. We know that lots happens at the state agency level. And sometimes state agencies get skipped over in advocacy work, but be building relationships with department secretaries and staff because there's rule changes and procedure changes and policy changes that can happen in the state agencies that don't have to even go all the way to the legislature. So, for example, we have a very strong relationship with the Department of Transportation, and I'm very pleased that Craig Thompson will be joining us tomorrow for that session. And we'll be able to talk with him about the important work that we do collaboratively with the Department of Transportation to really look at how do we become a more non-driver centered state and look at increasing transportation access. We have a really strong working relationship with the Wisconsin Elections Commission and have a lot of influence on how do we make voting and voting access more accessible. Their website, for example, is one of the most accessible to screen reader users of any website in the state of Wisconsin. And that is due in a lot to the strong working relationship between us and the Wisconsin Elections Commission. So our state agency partners are really vital. Our work with the media is really vital, and it's an important tool as well. So some of you may know that we've had some great success in working with Wisconsin Public Radio, Wisconsin Public Television, and the ABC affiliates around the state recently to really promote the necessity of access to the vaccine for folks with vision impairment. So our media relationships are really important. And our education work is also an important advocacy tool. So, folks will often say how scary it is, and me included, to cross streets, for example. And while we have the white cane law in Wisconsin that requires a driver to stop 10 feet from a pedestrian using a cane or a service animal, our lived experience is that that law is frequently broken. I've had folks ask me to lobby for the stopping distance to be 25 feet, which in theory makes sense, but it's not enforceable. And if people don't stop in 10 feet, they certainly aren't going to stop at 25 feet. So we know that our public education efforts here are better spent than legislative efforts. And so it's why we work with mayors from around the state to help us spread the message about pedestrian safety and they're in within their municipality, their city, their town. It's why we, do a lot of public effort, public education effort to help people understand, and why we work with driver education schools, and why we work with police departments to better educate folks who are interfacing with the public about the necessity for pedestrian safety. So, those are a lot of the tools that we use on a daily basis for doing our advocacy work. And where we want to move to next is talking more specifically about the legislative side of that, both on the budget and on legislative or lawmaking priorities and positions. And so, in that spirit, I want to introduce you to Aaron Fabrizius and Michael Blumenfeld from Blumenfeld and Associates. These two people are really vital partners to the council's work. Like me, they have feet on the ground in the Capitol, or at least these days via Zoom in the Capitol, and even more so than me. So they have relationship because they represent multiple clients with similar interests. So they often serve as important connectors to helping us get meetings with lawmakers. They keep us well informed on what's happening on a very weedy, granular level in the state legislature. I could not devote the time to studying bill drafts and bill proposals like they can do, but they can raise those to us and then we can decide what actions are appropriate. So they are so critical as a part of our advocacy work. So Michael and Aaron, let me turn turn to you at this point to do some overview of what's happening in the legislature and how that interfaces with our priority work.
Great. Thank you, Denise. And hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this morning for this legislative training. I'm going to start out with just kind of an overview of looking at the legislature. I'd like to kind of set what we're dealing with. So today's election day. There's a lot of local elections up. We have the one statewide race superintendent, and you might recall there was an election last November, and it was presidential election, but also our legislature, the entire assembly, and half the state senate was up. Several months ago, going into this election, I think Republicans thought that they had a good chance of picking up at least 3 seats in each house, which would have given them a veto-proof majority. So if the governor vetoed bills, they could override them. But things didn't go quite that way. In the state assembly, they lost a couple seats, but in the state senate, they picked up some seats. So both houses are firmly in Republican control, which has been the case for several years. And we still have Governor Evers and his administration. So we're dealing with split government for another 2 years. We also have a lot of changes, though, within leadership, especially on the Senate side. 33 senators, and we actually got 8 new senators. There's good chance someone on the webinar this morning has a new state senator from all over the state. There are several that were in the state assembly that moved over to the Senate, and then we have some entirely new folks as well. So that really changes the dynamic as well. Leadership changed, and that really matters because both houses really are kind of leadership from the top down. And so Scott Fitzgerald, who was majority leader for quite a while, ran for Congress and won his seat. That was Jim Sensenbrenner, who held that seat kind of near the Milwaukee area for 40 years. And so now he moved to Washington, and we have new leadership. Devin Mayhew from the Sheboygan area is the new majority leader, and Chris Kappenga from kind of west of Milwaukee is a new Senate president, and then Pat Teston, who's from the Stevens Point area, is pro tem, and Dan Fine from Fond du Lac continues as the assistant majority leader. But having new leadership does matter, and that kind of impacts what we do. On the assembly side, there were, I just would say the Senate Democratic leadership, the minority leadership didn't really change. You might recall a good friend of the council's, Jen Schilling from La Crosse, resigned before her term was up, and she was the minority leader. So Senator Bewley from Superior, Ashland, that northwest part of the state, took over. So she was reelected with Senator Ringhan as the assistant minority leader. But on the assembly side, I'll get into the leadership in a minute, but there were 16 new representatives out of 99. So kind of typical, maybe a little bit above average, but it was significant that the Democrats actually defeated 2 Republicans. And this was kind of in the Milwaukee area as well. So 16 new reps. We have first Asian American, first Muslim. So the new class does bring some diversity, as well as, again, folks from all over the state. In the leadership, Speaker Robin Voss is becoming, I think, the longest serving speaker. He was reelected. And so really, Tyler August, Speaker Pro Tem, Majority Leader Jim Steineke from Green Bay, they remain in those seats. They were reelected. And then Kevin Peterson is the new assistant majority leader. There was a little bit of a change there. The Democratic leadership didn't really change. Gordon Hins from La Crosse was reelected minority leader, with Diane Hesselbein from the Madison Middleton area reelected as the assistant leader, and Mark Spicer from Beloit leads the caucus. So that's kind of what we started with in January. They came into session, and early January they're sworn in right after New Year's and started working on bills. They've already introduced over 240 bills in the Assembly and over 280 bills in the Senate, which is actually kind of high. So there's a lot going on. The governor's already signed about 24 bills into law. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and kind of drill down a little bit more on issues and priorities.
Yeah, so Michael kind of covered the players in terms of leadership and the makeup of the legislature. So as you heard him mention, there were a lot of new faces elected both to the Senate and the Assembly, and in the Senate specifically, some changes to leadership. So if you haven't, please check to see if your state senator or state representative have changed, because this is a great opportunity to reach out to them, to educate them kind of on some of the council's key issues, which I'll be talking about. But just building off of Michael, we're going to touch briefly on some of the legislative priorities or the focus of the legislature and the governor at the moment, and then we'll dig more into the state budget bill. So the legislature, after coming into session in January, has really been focused on a couple main themes. Unsurprisingly, COVID-19 related legislation has really dominated the legislative focus, and it really runs the gamut. So there are bills related to how Wisconsin should spend federal funding related to COVID-19, legislation related to the state's response to COVID-19, and then lots of different smaller policies like who can administer vaccines. So dentist, one of the bills that was signed into law earlier this session, is allowing dentists to administer the COVID-19 vaccine. So a lot of action and focus there in the legislature. But also, as a result of the 2020 election, there is a very large package of voting and election law change legislation, which we will talk more about. If you signed up for our Thursday session on accessibility, we'll dig into those voting bills. And then there's also a fair amount of bills related to criminal justice reform and law enforcement reform. So that's kind of the things that the legislature is focused on at the moment. And then the governor's focus has been twofold. The main focus for the governor is the state budget bill, which he introduced on February 16th, 2021. And so that's the state's spending plan for the next 2 years. It's a 92.9 billion with a B bill. So very substantial bill. It's about 1,800 pages. And then the governor's other focus is on the use of federal COVID-19 relief funds. So the federal government has passed a series of COVID-19 response bills. Several of those bills, including the most recent bill, the American Rescue Plan Act, have provided states with flexible pots of money to respond to the pandemic. So from the most recent bill, the American Rescue Plan, Wisconsin is going to get 3.2 billion with a B again in flexible state relief funds that the governor can choose to spend. So that's really what the governor is focusing on at the moment: state budget, COVID-19 response. And in terms of the COVID-19 response, the governor is kind of focused on some key priorities. So he's already said this most recent pot of money, he wants a portion to go to tourism. He wants 600 million to go to grants to small businesses to help them recover from the pandemic. And something that's of interest to the council, the governor says he wants $200 million to go to infrastructure, which would include broadband. And then 500 million just generally to the state's pandemic response. So that would be things like testing and vaccine administration. And then in terms of the governor's budget, his priority areas that he invested in that budget bill, again, a key priority for the council is broadband expansion. The governor also included a lot of criminal justice reform proposals in his budget, Medicaid expansion, which you've probably heard a lot about. That's one of the governor's key priorities, public education funding, climate change, and caregiving. So that's kind of the governor's priorities at the moment. And a lot of those areas do overlap with the council's priorities. And so we're going to dig in a little bit to the state budget bill, specifically as it relates to the council's priorities, which Denise outlined. So I've spent a lot of time reading through the 1,800 page bill. And so just a few highlights to related to the council's priority areas. So under accessibility, as we've mentioned a couple of times, broadband access is something that the council has really talked a lot about, specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. The governor's budget invests $200 million for broadband. So that would go towards broadband expansion grants and different things like that to expand access throughout the state, including some requirements to do broadband mapping to see where we really do lack access in the state. So it's something the council is supporting this budget. The governor's budget would also create a voter bill of rights, which would require polling places to post a list of rights that voters have, including if you have a disability, the fact that you have a right to have assistance in casting your ballots. The budget would also create state level ABLE accounts. So these are something that have been around for a few years that were created on the federal level, and states were given the option to open these accounts for their residents. So essentially ABLE accounts are tax exempt savings accounts that will allow people with disabilities to pay for qualified expenses. So they're very flexible. ABLE funds can be used to pay for education, housing, transportation, and what's key, they are not subject to tax, but they also do not count against your eligibility for public assistance programs like Medicaid. So the idea is this is supposed to help people with disabilities gain savings and to have more resources available to pay for their needs. The criteria to be eligible to open an ABLE account is just that you have a disability or blindness that has occurred before you turned 26 years old. So again, the state budget would create a Wisconsin-based ABLE program for our residents to access. And then under the DNR budget, there's an accessibility provision that Denise kind of alluded to earlier for the Go Wild system, which is the state system to buy hunting and fishing licenses and to make reservations for campsites. The governor's budget would allow state issued identification cards to count for establishing residency for the purpose of purchasing recreational licenses. So this was like a barrier that existed or does exist currently, where only driver license can count to validate your residence, but under the governor's budget, you could use a state identification card. So those are kind of the accessibility things that we're looking at in the proposed budget. For education, the governor provided a significant investment in special education, which is a council priority item. So the governor's budget would increase special education funding by $700 million over the biennium. It would also allow the Wisconsin Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired to get reimbursed for providing school breakfast. So again, supporting the center is something that is on the council's priority document. And then special education transition readiness grants. The governor would provide an additional $1.5 million for that grant program, which is designed to help students with disabilities transition to the workforce or post-secondary education. So those are the three education things we're monitoring in the budget. And then for our priority area of employment, there's several items that we're looking at. One item, the governor's budget would require state agencies to attempt to ensure that at least 1% of their spending each year is paid to businesses owned by people with disabilities. And it would create standards for the state to certify disability-owned businesses for the purposes of state contracting and state purchasing. This is an expansion of a current law program that directs the state to spend a certain amount from businesses owned by women and veterans. So it would expand it to businesses owned by people with disabilities, which is something that's favorable. It would also, the governor's budget would also create a state level work opportunity tax credit. So there's already a federal credit to this effect, but it would create one in Wisconsin as well. So this is a program that provides tax credits to employers for hiring groups of people who traditionally have barriers to employment. So that does include people with disabilities, and employers could qualify for credits that would reimburse them for a portion of wages paid to workers who have barriers to employment. And then related to council priorities, there is a small increase for the vocational rehabilitation program, DVR program. It would increase state funding by about $1 million for the state match to ensure that we're getting our full federal match on DVR services. So that's positive. And then for unemployment insurance, this is also something mentioned on the council's priority document. It would repeal a current law prohibition on Social Security recipients receiving unemployment. Under current law, if you're on Social Security in Wisconsin, you cannot get unemployment insurance. This was something that was temporarily fixed by the state COVID-19 legislation passed in April. The governor's budget would permanently get rid of that prohibition. In the council's priority area of healthcare, the governor's budget, as I mentioned before, would expand Medicaid eligibility to people with incomes up to 138% of the federal poverty level. The Evers administration estimates that this would open up Medicaid eligibility to about 100,000 new people. We're also keeping an eye on a proposal to create a family caregiver tax credit. So the governor's budget proposes creating a new $500 tax credit to help unpaid caregivers cover expenses. So that would include purchasing assistive technology. And then aging and disability resource centers would receive an extra $7 million in this budget. So those are kind of the things we're looking at in healthcare area. As you'll see, this is kind of like the one area where council priorities were not really addressed. So we're still pushing to address some of the access issues for the Office of Blind and Visually Impaired. So this is one area that we're looking to kind of maybe have things added to the budget. And then last but not least, our main issue area of transportation, which again, we will dig into this more if you signed up for the transportation specific training, but just a couple high level highlights here. Mass transit funding, which is a council priority. The governor would increase transit funding by 2.5% per year. The budget would also create 2 new DMV customer service centers, one in Dane County and one in Brown County. And then the Specialized Transit Assistance Program, which provides transportation aids for older adults and people with disabilities, would get a small inflationary increase in both years of the budget. The council has been advocating for a larger increase of 10%. And then there's also some language about excluding from county and municipal levy limits cross municipality transit routes. So this is like a local tax change that would allow municipalities to work together to have transit routes that cross either city or county lines. All right, so Michael's going to take back over. And so that's kind of a lay of the land of the state budget process as it relates to the council's priorities. And Michael's going to talk about next steps in the state budget process.
Thanks, Aaron. So Aaron mentioned the budget several times, and that really is the main document that the legislature is working on now. It's actually it's a piece of legislation. It's a bill. It's the only bill that has to pass every session. And so we've got the budget introduced in February, and it's immediately referred to the Joint Finance Committee. And I'm sure many of you know about the Joint Finance Committee. It's a 16-member committee, evenly split between the Senate and Assembly, and they really do the bulk of the work on the budget. We, unlike some states and even in Washington, where there's a committee that raises money and committees that spend money, we have one committee that does the entire budget. Since the Republicans control both houses, they control the joint committee. So there's 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And so where we are in the process now, the budget's introduced, and then the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which are the analysts for the Finance Committee, took about a month to analyze the budget, came out with their document that agency by agency, and now beginning actually today, they will start doing agency briefings. So what they do is they call in different agencies to come before the committee, and they can make their statements of what they want to highlight, and then they're in the hot seat for sometimes up to a few hours, where the legislature can the legislators on the committee can ask questions. What's kind of interesting, at least to us, this year, is that they're only going to call in 4 agencies. There have been years where they go through most agencies, but they picked DPI, which oversees education, DWD, which DVR is, as well as unemployment, workforce issues, and then DNR and the Public Service Commission with broadband. So that's kind of interesting. And then Friday, the public hearings start. They'll have public hearings for the rest of the month, which we're going to talk more about, but wonderful opportunities for input on the budget. There's going to be 3 public hearings in person and 1 virtual. And then once the hearings are done, end of the month, the committee will start voting on the budget. And they just go usually agency by agency, and they will add, subtract, kind of craft their version of the budget. A lot of the issues we care about, big issues in the Medicaid, Health and Human Services area, education, transportation, those will probably be towards the end of the process, which is usually later, the last half of May. So we'll see how that goes. I talked before about changes in the Senate. Well, there's really a lot of changes on this committee as well. Longtime co-chair Alberta Darling from the Milwaukee area is no longer chair of the committee. She's still in the legislature. She's currently chairing the Senate Education Committee. But Howard Markline from Southwest Wisconsin is the new co-chair, which is a big change. He's been on the committee for a while, but now he's co-chair. And then John Nydren, who was about to become, I think, the longest serving co-chair, abruptly resigned in December. So that was interesting. He is now heading the Health Plans Association, the association that a bunch of local HMOs. So he resigned, and Mark Bourne from Beaver Dam, who was on the committee, is now the new co-chair. So two new co-chairs, I think, sets a very different tone. Of the 16 members, there's 7 new ones, so that's very significant. Several, again, came from the Assembly, now in the Senate, and there's 4, and then 2, Dale Coenga and Mary Felskowski, they were in the assembly on joint finance, not for a while, but in the past, but now they're in the Senate and they're back on joint finance. So there's some experience, but there's certainly some people that have never been on finance too. So that'll, I think, change the dynamic as well. So that's the Joint Finance Committee. And now we're going to move into kind of advocacy, how to advocate, how to have good visits. And I'm going to turn it back to Erin.
Yes, so the budget now is in the hands of the Joint Finance Committee. And so I think what's important to highlight is just because the governor put something in his budget doesn't mean it's going to stay in his budget. So the Finance Committee, they have the ability to add, remove, or modify anything in the budget. So it's very important right now to reach out to members of the legislature, specifically people on finance, but also your personal state representative and state senator, to let them know what you think should be in the state budget bill, because nothing is guaranteed. So we're going to talk about ways to effectively advocate for the council's priorities. So just some general tips for how to prepare for a visit to make sure you have a successful visit. Really important before you meet with your state representative or state senator to always do your homework. So to know who you're meeting with. Are you meeting with the actual legislator or are you meeting with staff? It's not uncommon to meet with legislative staff, and they're just as important. You should never be discouraged if your meeting is with staff. They're just as important as the legislator. Also good to understand what part of the state they represent. Most legislators represent more than one county. So sometimes it's helpful to know what other areas they represent in addition to where you live. What committees they serve on. So committees are really key to the legislative process. That's the first stop after a bill gets introduced. The first stop is a legislative committee, which will hold a hearing and vote on the bill. And the vote that the committee makes could advance the bill to the full assembly or full Senate. So if the legislator you're meeting with is on a committee that's related to our priority areas, that's really important to know. And then every legislator kind of has some pet issues that they really like. You know, some people are very into the environment, some people are really into transportation, things like that. So it's important to know, what does this lawmaker really care about? And are there ways to connect our ask to kind of the things that they're passionate about? And then do they have a personal connection to the issue, or even a former professional connection to the issue? So in the legislature, there's a lot of people who have had different careers before they became a lawmaker. So there's people who used to be teachers, or people who used to be nurses. So it's kind of helpful to know what their professional background is, again, just to see if they have a connection to our issues, to help you kind of talk to them in a certain way. And then always important to know the status of the issue you're lobbying on. So if you're talking about a bill, has the bill been introduced? Has there been any action on the bill? So for example, has it had a public hearing yet? Has it been passed by one house or not the other? And then for the budget bill, of course, we kind of know where those things are. The bill was introduced just before the Joint Finance Committee, but important to know where the bill is at in the process so you can know specifically what you need to ask the lawmaker. So it could be, hold a hearing on this bill, or please vote on this bill when it's before you in the state assembly. Other pre-visit activities, the main thing that you need to do besides your homework on your lawmaker is to really think about your elevator pitch. So the main thing that you want to convey when you talk to your lawmaker is you want to get across, who are you? What's your issue? Why does the issue matter? And what can the lawmaker do about it? So those are the kind of the things you want to make sure you cover as you prepare for your visit. And also important to think about if there's any supplemental materials you want to bring along. So in the council's case, you all will receive copies of the council's legislative priorities. So you can bring those along to your visit to guide your visit with your lawmaker. And then if you're meeting with other people as part of a group, really important before the visit to determine each person's role. So does someone want to serve as facilitator? Who's going to talk about what issue? Those things are important to determine beforehand. And then just some tips really quickly about kind of crafting your elevator pitch or using your personal story to advocate. So things that are helpful to think about is what is your goal that the legislature could do something about? So like, let's say, increase transit funding. And then what are key elements of your personal story that relate to the goal of, let's say, increasing transit funding? So that could be personal stories or even professional stories. So maybe you know that in order for you to get to Madison to even meet with your legislator, it would take you 2 days if you were trying to use public transit. That's a really good example to back up your ask of why we need better investment in transit. So again, thinking about those links between your personal story and your goals are really helpful to help you hone your message and your elevator pitch. Because really the thing that's most effective for lawmakers, they hear from paid professionals like Michael and I a lot. But the thing that makes the most difference is real people telling their real stories. So again, you as a constituent of a lawmaker have a lot of power to talk about your real world experience. All right, so now we'll talk about the actual visit and some do's and don'ts to keep in mind. And I think Michael and Denise are both going to join me for this portion.
So for a successful visit, we like talk do's and don'ts. For the do's, my rule of thumb is the golden rule. You treat people the way you would want to be treated. So being on time, being civil, being polite, introducing yourself. As Erin said, she kind of mentioned some of these things of being organized, and as well as kind of sticking to the script. I mean, when you're there on behalf of the council, it's very important to stay on message, and then always making note of what follow up if something comes up and you've kind of agreed to follow up on something, and then always really good to ask for the contact information. Because I can tell you, I've done this a long time, and I think I'll remember that staff person's name, and then there's 2 offices later, and I'm not quite so sure. So everybody has business cards, and if they don't have business card, certainly just to ask the name. So I think that's really good. Then there's the don'ts, and one thing, and I think Erin also mentioned this about meeting with staff. These offices are really pretty small. I mean, in the assembly, they may have a couple staff people. In the Senate, it's 3 or 4. It depends if it's leadership or, chair of a major committee. And things are very busy. I know today, for example, legislators, it wouldn't be unusual for them to have 2 or 3 hearings at the same time. So, legislators want to meet with their constituents. But if you have to meet with staff, that's still very important. Another thing is don't answer a question you don't know. It's okay not to know an answer, and actually, I kind of like it when they're asking questions, and it's a great way to follow up. That's a great question, and we'll get back to you. So don't ever hesitate to do that. And then, of course, don't get in an argument or a heated back and forth. I mean, there'll be legislators that love our issues and others that, may not agree with us. And as I always say, 132 legislators, they do represent all facets of our state. And so there may be a couple of them that actually want to get into it a little bit on different issues, but um, we of course we always stay above that. And then also don't forget who you're representing, that you're there representing the priorities of the council. And I think that's important as well. Um, the last thing I'd say, and then I want to turn it over to Denise, is kind of the post-visit activities. Because if you think the meeting with the legislator once a year is going to kind of move issues along, it's not. And so we see these visits as either continuing relationships or building relationships. And really it's all about those relationships. So of course, a thank you note afterwards. If there was any requested information, any follow-up, that's important. And then keep them updated on issues. You've made that connection now, and to send them a note, an email, a phone call on things that you think they might be interested in, or updating them on an issue that you brought up, is also a good way to kind of keep that relationship building. And then, of course, if there's any opportunities to meet with them in the district, to talk about an issue, they would love to do that when they're home. But what we're going to do now is talk a little bit about some real examples. Denise, of course, has some kind of real world examples of meeting with legislators and policymakers, and is going to talk a little bit about that. And then if we've got time, I might talk a little bit about what's it like to be in my former life, being a staffer in the Capitol and greeting folks as well. So I'll turn it over to Denise.
Great. Thank you so much, you guys. Good. And keep your cameras on if you would, Michael and Aaron, because we have staff
Okay.
doing a couple screenshots for social media. So thank you both so much for an excellent and super informative presentation. The priority documents that Aaron mentioned were emailed to you as links by Kathleen yesterday afternoon. And so if you have not had time to take a look at those, I'd invite you to do that sometime this week. And they're available in accessible formats, either as accessible PDFs or as Word documents. Those documents will also be emailed to state legislators and the governor's office, and all legislators will receive a physical copy, a nice folder with materials in it, including some other materials about the council. So your legislators will have those as well. And when you're setting up your visit, you may want to reference those for them so that they can pull them out and have them for their review before they meet with you. Aaron and Michael both really hit on the point, and I want to emphasize it too, that when you're meeting with your legislator, my best experience is to pick one or two things to focus on. Typically, our time with them is about a half an hour, and that half an hour goes incredibly fast. And there are so many things that are important to us as people living with blindness. We can't dump our bucket on the legislator's desk because they'll become overwhelmed. And then when people are overwhelmed, they typically do nothing. So make that time really matter. So as I've been meeting with legislators this spring, particularly about voting issues, I pick one or two things that I know I really want to accomplish. So I maybe really want to accomplish on helping the legislator understand the barriers to voting for people with vision impairment. And then I have one ask, that they consider introducing legislation that would allow for an absentee ballot, or maybe that they consider investigating more why indefinitely confined provisions for voters are really important. But I have one key ask. So I have my couple of talking points. I have a story or two to really illustrate that. And then I have my ask, and that's my sequence. I also really think about these visits as such incredibly valuable opportunities for learning on both sides. Legislators are human beings. I mean, they are folks who care, as Aaron said, about certain things and are less knowledgeable about others. Think about the work of a state legislator and all of the issues that live in this state, from groundwater contamination to broadband to budgetary concerns and any deficits. There's just a lot that they have to know something about. And as people with vision impairment, we represent only about 2% of the population. So it's not going to be surprising if they don't know a lot about us and our issues. That's not a fault of theirs. And it's our job to help them learn, to really bring these issues to reality, because in some ways they may know folks who are visually impaired, especially if they have an older parent or an older spouse or someone that they love who's losing vision impairment. So making that personal connection with them and helping them to learn about our lives and how our lives matter in the state, why having employment opportunities matters not just to us, it matters to everyone in the state. Why having education that's focused and appropriate matters. So, making those connections, helping legislators connect the dots, really a big and very important job, so that they leave the meeting with a little bit more knowledge and maybe a little bit more compassion or open-heartedness than they came into the meeting with. And time again, I love legislative visits. We just had one a couple of weeks ago where the legislator kept saying, "Oh my gosh, I am learning a lot. I am learning a lot. Next time you come and meet with me, can we talk about X, Y, and Z? And next time you meet with me, will you call me by my first name?" Those to me are significant successes. I don't go in with an attachment that the legislator is going to say to me, "Sure, Denise, tomorrow I'll introduce a bill that calls for an accessible absentee ballot." If that ever happened, it would be glorious. But I don't have that expectation, because they need to study it, they need to think about it, they need to talk to other members of their party and other lawyers, and there needs to be a whole conversation. But when a legislator says to me, "I've learned a lot from you, and by the way, call me by my first name," I know that we have put some deposits in each other's emotional bank accounts, and that is a major win. The other thing that's a major win for me is when I learn something I didn't know before about the legislator. That's awesome. So I can do all my homework in advance, and I do. When a legislator tells me a personal story that's somehow relating to what we're talking about, or when the legislator says, on the national level, I work on these issues, or I have a prior background in transportation administration or something like that, I'm like, that's golden, because now we have something common to talk about and build off of. And I also know how that's going to impact our strategy going forward. So when we get back together as a group on May 7th, and I'm so excited that many of you have said you'd like to come back for the debriefing, that will be an opportunity for us to share those kinds of stories, to say, this is where my legislator really lit up, where they got really excited as we talked, or this is where my legislator got concerned or defensive, or this is what I learned from my legislator about what their priorities are, and to be able to do that sharing and that networking together. So I'm so excited for you to set up your visits we'll send a handout following the sessions this week that walks you through how to set up your visit, where to go to get that contact information if you don't already have it. You'll notice that the sources for where to get your legislative information, we've ordered them from most accessible to least accessible. So start at the top, which is calling the legislative hotline, if you choose to do that, and they'll look up your legislator and contact for you. Or use the next website that we list, which is more accessible than the last website that we list. Set up those visits. And then, really enjoy yourself while you're doing it. It's, imagine that you're meeting a new potential friend and have that attitude of mind and that big heart, and it will open the door to some potential very powerful and poignant conversations with your legislator. So I think that I could say more, certainly, because I feel very passionately about this, and that feels like plenty for right now. So Michael, let me turn it to you in the time that we have to talk a little bit about, your perspective of what made for a successful visit as a staffer. And then also, Lynn, I'm noticing that there are some chats in the chat box. I can't read them, but I can see them. And so let me turn to Michael for a moment to talk for a couple tips from a staffer side. And then Lynn, I'd love for you to share some of the questions that might be happening in the chat in the Q&A.
So working in the Capitol as a staffer, I would greet people, and I would have the pleasure to meet with constituents, lobbyists, leaders from different associations, and oftentimes it was just me. And also the legislators that I worked for, and this is something that you may run into, a lot of times legislators will like the staff in the meeting. So that should be, that's not good or bad. I actually think it's a good thing.
Good.
Because the legislator can focus more and the staffer could be taking notes. Sometimes staff may chime in, but typically not. I never did. I thought if someone was meeting with my boss, the legislator, that should be the focus, and I was just kind of there. Sometimes the legislator would ask me a question or for me to do something, but I'd be looking for, the kinds of things we talked about. If they kind of knew where if not where the legislation was at, like what they knew about it, but again, why did they care? What did it mean to them? So as Denise was kind of saying, um, as a staffer or a legislator, we want to hear about what does it mean to you? What's the impact? And those real stories are what really kind of move people and helps illustrate. If you can imagine, there's a couple thousand bills and resolutions every session that are being introduced. And so most legislators and staffers, especially, that have to look at everything are generalists. And you may walk into an office that they're really focused on transportation, but there's not that many of the legislators. I mean, they all have to care about transportation, but there's not that many experts. So really, you got to keep in mind that you are the expert. You're the expert of your issues and your life, and you want to bring that to the office. So I mean, I haven't worked in the legislature in a long time, but there's stories that still stick with me of people that were able to kind of illustrate why this budget provision or why this piece of legislation, what it meant for them or their family, or their business, that type of thing. So I think that's important to highlight as well. So as a staffer, it was really one of my highlights, and I think staff really do like meeting with folks, especially again when they've got something to say and it's respectful and it turns into a good discussion. A lot of times when I met with constituents and even others that were just leaders in organizations, I wanted to get their name, I wanted to get their phone number so that I had a resource. And so keep that in mind. Aides are really busy, and as well as legislators, but they're looking for resources. And that's part of our goal, is to make sure that you become one of those resources. So I'm going to end there because I know our time is short. But I think Aaron wanted to just comment on kind of tracking down your legislator, how to set up meetings. But I think first we wanted to see if Lynn had any questions or things to talk about from the chat.
Thanks, Michael. We don't have any questions as yet, but I just wanted to make sure that I let everybody know that to save the date, May 7th from noon to 1 for a chance to share and debrief together how your legislative visit went. So a link will come in the email for that debrief session, but just so you have it, save the date on May 7th, noon to 1. That's about all we have. We don't have a lot of chatter. And any questions, just type them here or in the Q&A for us, and we'll get to them.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. I'm just going to do real quick. Denise mentioned we do have a hand app that will be coming out later. That really is a step-by-step guide of how to set up your visit with your state representative and state senator, but I was just going to highlight some things quickly. So again, on that document, it does have a list of places you can go to get contact information for the people who represent you in the state legislature, including the legislative hotline, which is a number you can call and talk to someone and they can connect you to your lawmaker. Also on the state legislative website homepage, which is legis.wisconsin.gov. On that homepage, there is a little search box that says, who are my legislators? And then there's a couple other resources. So those are how to get contact information for your lawmakers. But just some tips for setting up, as Denise already mentioned, the default meeting length is 30 minutes. And people assume when you call their office that your preferred venue is in the state capitol. But due to COVID, you have a choice, and most lawmakers are flexible to meet virtually. But just make sure you say that if you want a virtual meeting when you call, that you would like to meet virtually. Otherwise, the office will assume you're coming to the Capitol. And then as like vaccination rates increase and people feel comfortable meeting in person again, the third option you can do as a constituent is to ask to meet in the district. So most lawmakers are comfortable, meeting you at a coffee shop or maybe even coming to your place of employment. So that's another option post-COVID that you can do to meet with your lawmaker. And so just some tips, you can call or email the office. Our little toolkit has even a sample email that you could use. And you just want to ask to talk to the person who handles scheduling. Really important to let them know that you are a constituent. Constituents do get preference in setting up meetings, and just let them know that you want to find a time to meet with your lawmaker to discuss some issues that are important to people who are blind and visually impaired. Again, specify if you want it to be a virtual meeting. So those are just kind of the general tips. And then to the point of doing your homework before a meeting on the legislative website, again, that's legis.wisconsin.gov, which Denise is right. It's not a very accessible website, unfortunately, for screen reader purposes. But on that website, each lawmaker has a profile that you can click on details, and you can see the names of their staff, what committees they're on, and what bills they have authored. So again, it kind of helps you do your homework. Otherwise, again, because unfortunately the website is not super accessible, you can Google. There will be probably articles that pop up about the lawmaker. So just to close out next steps here, we will be getting that little document out about how to set up your legislative visit. But so really the goals after today are for you to set up your own appointment to meet with your state senator and state representative to talk about our key priorities. You can also look for in-district listening sessions that might be happening. And then the final thing is there are currently public hearings happening this month on the state budget. So there are several opportunities for you to advocate on the state budget to the Joint Finance Committee. The dates of those Joint Finance budget hearings are April 9th at UW Whitewater from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. That's in person. April 21st at the Hodag Dome in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, also in person from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. April 22nd at UW Stout, also in person, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And there is one virtual opportunity on April 28th. Pre-registration will be required, but it's not open yet, but the council will update you when that happens. So those are kind of the next steps after this meeting, and I'll turn it over to Michael and Denise to conclude.
Michael, would you like to say any words in conclusion? And then I'll bring it home.
No, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time. It's so critical that we have folks engaged in these issues, because we, as the public affairs counselors, the lobbyists, there's things that we can do, and Denise and the leadership and staff can do things, but we really need you to be out there talking to legislators and doing this. So really appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to be here today, and look forward to talking with folks the next couple of days on accessibility and transportation. So thank you.
Michael and Aaron, thank you so much for your good work, and thank you to our staff support team for all of your work in putting this together and running what felt like a very successful event this morning. I'm super excited about gathering with folks this afternoon, and looks like many of our folks have signed up for both the transportation and the accessibility sessions. And if you have not signed up for both of those and you'd like to add yourself, that's still an opportunity. Just reach out to Kathleen. We're more than happy to welcome you. If you'd like to come to this afternoon session to hear from Representative Subeck from the Madison area, who will speak about her experience of welcoming visitors, you're welcome to do that. You just let Kathleen know. You can either attend the whole session, which will be quite similar to this morning's, or just join at about 5:30 or so, and Representative Subeck will be joining about that time or shortly thereafter. So you're welcome to do that. Please watch your email for that how to prepare for a legislative visit handout. The other thing that I'll be including in that is that we just announced this morning through a press release that we are co-sponsoring an issue brief for legislators and the media on voting, and that will happen at noon on Monday, April 12th, in advance of a public hearing on the 15th. And so you're welcome to attend that if you'd like to. One of the things we'd love is if you help your legislator to know about it and consider inviting them to this briefing as well, which will include a national expert on disability and elder voting access, and then myself and several of my fellow voting access advocates who are very concerned about access for people with disabilities and older adults in the voting process. So your voice and your action really matters. We really value you as our allies and support folks, and your stories are powerful. So please take this opportunity to dig in deeper to the council's priorities, do that reading, do that learning, and set up those visits with legislators. And we're excited to dive deeper into transportation and accessibility and voting tomorrow and Thursday. So thanks again for your early morning time this morning. Have a great